All right. It is the week of November 7th, 2022, and this is the Fight Business Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Auger, and today we've got a lot of ground to cover because I've been out for a couple weeks. First, we're going to do a UFC 281 pay-per-view buy prediction. Haven't done one of those in a while, and it's a fun, exciting pay-per-view coming up, so I'm going to give you my best estimate as to what that might be, especially with some recent news about how UFC pay-per-views have been doing as of late. Then we're going to talk about Francis Ngannou's recent comments in an interview with Joe Pompliano. I think that's how you say his last name. You know how I am. But fantastic interview here. A lot of in-depth stuff about his contract disputes with the UFC, as well as some interesting points about things like health insurance and terms he wants for his next deal. So definitely need to cover that. Then we're going to talk about Endeavor's Q3 earnings. They did just announce their 2022 Q3 earnings. We'll break that down and analyze it. Not super surprising given the macroeconomic environment, but some interesting tidbits in there, especially with Endeavor content being sold off and how that might affect things going forward with rising interest rates, all that fun stuff. Then we're going to talk World Fight League. So I haven't had a chance to comment on this, but great story that has been broken by Al Zuliano. Again, Al, I'm so sorry, friend of the show, about where the World Fight League is, promotion that was supposed to start next year. Seems like things may not be happening. We'll break down what Al said, as well as why and how this type of thing happens, because it's kind of common, especially in other industries in the startup world. Then we'll do our quick hits. And last but not least, we have to cover the ongoing story about a fight that just occurred in the UFC that may have some betting regulation issues. So we'll break all of that down and talk about what it means going forward. If there was any indication of, I don't want to say foul play because it's not murder, but, nefarious dealings and so on and so forth. So if you're on YouTube, like, subscribe, bell notification, timestamps at the bottom as always. And let's go ahead and dive right in. All right. So we've got a lot of heavy topics and analysis in this episode. So I wanted to start off with something a little bit fun, and that is the old pay-per-view buy prediction. This time for UFC 281. It is the now annual UFC show in Madison Square Garden, headlined by Israel Adesanya defending his belt against Alex Pereira. You've got Carla Esparza defending the strawweight title against Weili Zhang. You've got a banger of a fight between Dustin Poirier and Michael Chandler. It's a pretty stacked card. They usually stack up this card in MSG, save the time they almost did Valentina versus Sajara Eubanks, but Derek Lewis and Daniel Cormier stepped in to save the day there. But yeah, it's usually a pretty stacked card. A lot of big fights all the way throughout. This is no exception. It's pretty stacked top to bottom, especially given what else we've had this past year. And interesting point of note here is that I forgot exactly where I read it. I'm not sure if it was in a SBJ article or it was through Ari Emanuel comments or something of that nature, but you'll notice that we don't have a lot of pay-per-view buy numbers this year. We simply don't. The number we do have, Oliveira versus Gaethje, and that was around 400K ish, and that was from SBJ, and that was reportedly at the time the highest grossing pay-per-view of the year. So we know that Izzy versus Whitaker didn't do super well. I forget what the other pay-per-views were earlier on. I remember Izzy Whitaker, obviously, because we're about to talk about Adesanya's drawing power. But it is important to note that, because you would assume at this point that should the UFC be releasing any pay-per-view numbers through various sources at Sports Business Journal, that they're going to be at least 400K or in that range, right? If they're not, they're probably lower and quite possibly significantly lower. And we talked about how raising the pay-per-view price, the macro economic environment of inflation being, at a 40-year high at 8% in the US, which is, again, where most of the pay-per-view revenue comes from, right? I mean, no other country, 75, $80 for a pay-per-view. It's only in the US. We noted how that could affect everything. And the markets have been wild, and we'll talk about that more later when we get into Endeavor's Q3 earnings, but Adesanya was throughout the pandemic and even before, right? This rising star and was easily number 2, number 3 drawing power guy in the UFC. You had McGregor and you had Masvidal when he got hot with his streak, but beyond that, it was Adesanya. And Adesanya was a little bit more staying with his drawing power, one would assume, originally, right? Than Masvidal. Masvidal got hot, lost, and that was it. Um, and at this point, I doubt he's going to be bringing in any sort of draw. I mean, we know Colby and Masvidal wasn't a huge draw, any of that stuff. Adesanya, though, dominant middleweight champion, um, had been consistently high. But we also know, right, that aside of the Costa fight, I mean, he hasn't had an exciting performance in a long time. I mean, Rob Adesanya 2 was pretty boring. Romero obviously was terrible. Cannonier was so bad that people were walking out mid-fight. I mean, that's bad. And part of that is Adesanya again doing what he does best and people realizing, okay, I can't move in and eat those counters because I'll go to sleep. But it's also just, him hyping up his fights, trying to be this killer like he was early on in his run, right? Before people kind of figured out Adesanya's game, and they haven't figured it out to the point where they're beating him yet, although there are some decisions you could argue go the other way, Romero and Whitaker too specifically, but even then it's so close, right? Um, it's one of those things where they have figured out his opponents have figured out his style enough that it's they're not going to rush in to dangerous spots, and Adesanya isn't going to be the one that puts the pressure on, right? He's going to point fight. That's what he's always done. He points fights, he gets people to overcommit, and then he counters and he gets those huge knockouts. People aren't doing that anymore. They've picked up on the game, which has turned Adesanya into an extremely boring fighter. I can't say I enjoyed the Cannonier fight. I definitely didn't enjoy the Whitaker Romero fight. I'm not sure about everyone else, but I mean, it seemed pretty unanimous that those fights sucked from a fan perspective, which again, he won and he did what he was supposed to do, but it's tough. You have a lot of people always complaining about, you know, the lay and pray, right? And how there's the scoring stuff that's going on where like you got to count damage, all this, blah, 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 to try and make things more exciting. Well, I mean, this isn't lay and pray, but it's little point fighting tags here and there. I mean, it's not exciting. So that all being said, you're up against Alex Pereira here if you're Izzy Adesanya, and that's somebody who's beaten you twice. Now, I've seen a lot of chatter about, yes, it is kickboxing. The judges were wrong, is what I've heard in the first one. And then the second fight, Adesanya was winning until he wasn't, which I agree with the second one. The first one, it's been so long since I watched it. I'm really not sure. But this is a guy that has 2 wins over Adesanya in kickboxing. You're going to be using smaller gloves. It's not going to be, Para comes in and just figures it out. At least I don't think it'll be. But yeah, I mean it's an interesting fight, right? This is a guy who has actually beaten Adesanya technically in stand up, which is very few people can say that. So does that add a level to this? Maybe, but the problem is Para isn't a big enough name, right? That he's bringing a real B-side, and they've played up the rivalry to a point of like, oh, this is the guy who's going to dethrone Izzy. They've kind of done that and put some focus on that, but it's not. It doesn't feel like Cormier Jones, right? Where okay, here are the 2 top with bad blood. They hate each other. Here's this, real rivalry, even though Jones, easily won those. It doesn't feel like that. It feels like, okay, like this is a guy that's been rushed thanks to his knockout ability. He has wins over Izzy. Izzy has nobody else left to fight. The division is dead. Let's make it. So with that in mind, because you also have Whaley and Esparza, which again, Whaley has pull, but not in the US. I mean, she does. If you listen to the press conference, she obviously has fans, but I don't think she's bringing in a ton of buys on her own, right? I think she's bringing in more international viewers from China and overseas in that regard. So um, I I don't expect a bunch of people to pay $80 to see Whaley versus Esparza, especially because everybody assumes Whaley's going to murk Esparza, right? Um, yeah. So you've got Chandler Poirier, which are both, again, Poirier's gotten that bump from McGregor, so that could help a little bit here. But and Chandler's been in exciting fights, but still, I think when you look at everything as a whole, right now it's $80, and it's something where if I'm looking at the title fight, which we know statistically is by far the biggest draw, and then the co-main, which is the second biggest draw, I don't know that I'm throwing $80 up for, if I'm a regular fan, of course, as media, right? I'm gonna pay for it. But um I don't know if you're throwing up $80 for this. Yes, it is a stacked card. Agreed. And if you're a hardcore fan, sure, but I don't know that you're getting casual fans, especially when casual fans have been burned the last couple Izzy fights where it's been just snooze fest city, right? Um, the fact that Whitaker Izzy didn't break 400K buys was concerning enough. And then he fought Cannonier, which was even more boring. So that could only drive it down. So I'm going to say, I don't know that we'll ever get these numbers. I'm going to say 200K buys. I think it's stacked enough. You're looking at 200 and 250K buys, but I don't think you're looking much beyond that personally. Um, yeah, I just don't see it. I love it as a hardcore fan. Again, a lot of depth to this card. But to get those casual viewers, especially for those casual viewers to pay $80, it's hard. Easy's the headliner, and he's burned the casual fans. I mean, I'm sorry, but that's how it is. It's he's done the equivalent of a striking lay and pray, and that's going to turn off casual viewers. The fact that Whitaker Izzy 2, which outside of the Pereira match is probably the most exciting, interesting matchup, given what Whitaker did on that run to get back to a title fight. The fact that that did less than Oliveira versus Gaethje just kind of shows you how much Adesanya's drawing power has fallen off, right? Um, yeah, it's he went from being a massive draw, from being the style bender, pulling off these crazy knockouts and exciting fights, to just, man, boring fight city, and it is what it is. It's just how it goes. Since he's won the belt, he's got Costa. That's it. Almost every other fight has been snooze city. Um, so yeah, we'll see where it ends up. I'm going 200 250K buys. Again, don't know that we'll ever verify it. Let me know in the chat your thoughts on this. Are you going to pay, as a fan? Are you going to pay $80 for this? Do you feel like, even if you are or not, do you feel like it's worthy of $80? And then think about, again, because we're all hardcores here, if you're watching this show, probably, think about, as a casual fan, are you going to do this? Because I would feel like, as a casual fan, at most, I'm going to a bar that's showing it for free, right? I'm not paying cover. Maybe I'm having a drink or two. And sorry, had a little bit of technical glitchery there. Maybe I'm having a drink or two. We'll see how it goes. But yeah, I just think, it's 200 250K. Let me know. All right, next thing we have to talk about today is an interview that Francis Ngannou gave to Joe Pompliano. Again, apologize if I'm saying that wrong. But Joe's a sports business podcaster. He's got a channel on YouTube. Check it out. It's good stuff. And he landed an interview with Francis Ngannou. First half of it, they talk about Ngannou's life story and all of that. Second half is very interesting and covers a lot of comments regarding the UFC contract dispute that Ngannou was going through, what a fighter, experiences, in contract negotiations and in their contracts, as well as things he wants moving forward if he were to resign. Because he, spoiler alert, essentially says, yeah, next person that I would probably end up fighting, he's not sure, but maybe John Jones. But that's if we work out the contract. Lot to unpack here, a lot of good information. I know that I talk about this fair amount. John Nash obviously talks about it all the time. Paul Gift and Jason Cruz also talk on it. Couple other people out there do as well. But it's one thing for us as media to talk about this, to point to the court docs, the studies, the information we know. It is another to hear it from a fighter's perspective. So if you doubt the fighter pay, is 20% or less reports, if you doubt those, if you have doubts about those, I highly recommend this interview, because this is coming directly from the heavyweight champion's mouth and really just confirms a lot of what Nash and myself and others have reported, right? Francis talks about how, when you sign these contracts, there's 5 years of time, and generally when you're coming up as a fighter, you are excited to go to the next level and re-sign and go from, $100,000 to $200,000 a fight when you're at near that level. And that's awesome. But when you do that, he mentions that, that starts a whole nother 5 years and locks you in for a long time. Whereas if you're near the top of that level, or you're climbing in the rankings where you're starting to make six figures, you're probably worth 500,000. So a kind of struggle that fighters are going through is this uphill battle where, okay, I'm on my 20-20. I win my first couple fights spectacularly. They go ahead and up me to 16-60. I'm excited about that because that's triple of what I'm making, right? And this is just an example. Francis doesn't mention this specifically, but um, I'm making 16-60, and then I win a couple more. I'm going up. I sign again a new contract. Now I'm making 100K, and this is where Francis does mention, by the time I'm on that 100K contract, or that 100K now 200K contract, and by the time I'm really, up in title contention and making a splash and have these highlight reel knockouts or finishes, I'm really worth maybe now $500,000 after one or two fights. But my most recent contract locks me in for, you know, several fights over the course of 3, 4, 5 years. So even though it's only one or two fights that really take me from, okay, contender number 10 ranked guy to, a rising star or a title contender, I'm locked in to those lower rates. And as he mentions, right, if you end up, winning the belt or becoming, a big star, really getting that power, right? Say you're a Sean O'Malley, say you're Izzy on his way up, then that's great, but they'll make you re-sign and again get locked in for lower rates. Because once you get to a certain level, it only takes one or two fights to really catapult you from, okay, potential star to straight up superstardom, right? Think about Conor McGregor. He was, flying high as can be. He has the Dennis Siver fight. That's huge. And then he's supposed to do his title fight, and the popularity between him and for him, between that and then the Chad Mendez interim fight, right, where he gets that, and it kind of elevates him to another level. But then he beats Aldo, the way he beats Aldo, right? Once he does that, that catapults him. He's already popular at that point, but that catapults him to a whole new level of superstardom. Only takes one fight. And even Conor had some of these issues, right? He talked about renegotiating with the UFC, wanting, stock and those types of things when he beat Aldo and then wanted to go fight RDA and fight Diaz, right? Like he didn't want to do media as much. He had to push back. It it is a scale where a 4 or 5 year contract hinders you greatly, because you're not taking, 4 or 5 fights or however many fights that are on a 4 or 5-year contract, depending on what you sign. You're not taking that many fights to go from, the guy that's kind of known to the guy that is known everywhere. And Ngannou isn't as big as McGregor, right? I'm not saying that. He's not even as big as Adesanya towards his run, but he is big. And, had he beat Stipe the first time, I think he'd be in that crossover category for sure. I think that really set him back in terms of crossover appeal, but he's come back. He's built that name up again, right? He's handled that loss well. And since then, just been on that tear, won the belt, came back and looked, fantastic against Stipe the second time. At this point, right? If he's locked into that 5-year deal, because he didn't want to resign, he wanted the ability to do outside things. He talks about a crypto sponsorship that was over $1 million that he would have gotten, but was a competitor to Crypto.com. The UFC signs the Crypto.com deal, and Ngannou just loses that sponsorship. I mean, that's rough. But Ngannou has to adhere to the uniform policies, so he loses out on that money. It just is an important highlight. And again, I cannot stress enough that if you have doubts about me saying it or Nash saying it, then check out Ngannou saying it from the horse's mouth, right? It's, it is pretty apparent that it's a huge part of the UFC's business model, which from a business perspective is brilliant. I've talked about this. If you are looking at the UFC from a shareholder perspective, and I'm not talking about Endeavor, I'm talking about if just the UFC is public, man, that place is run in such a way that profits are coming. Anybody with shares in the UFC having a good time. Even with some of the stuff we'll talk about later in the show. Like they're doing great. They are locked in on contracts, they are locked in on media rights deals, they are just killing it. But that part of the reason for that comes at a cost to the fighters. And Ngannou very well knows that. He talks about, the possibility of unions and how it'll be hard because especially when you're, a 20K guy, you can't really sit out and join a union and join that line of like, I'm not going to fight until we're unionized or we've got a association. You've got to keep fighting and you've got to sign those extra deals. When the money difference, right, from somebody living on 20K going to 60K, 60K even is massive. That's life changing. It if you're trying to be just a pro fighter. And we've seen this, right? We know about multiple contenders that had to get to a ranking or really become a hot prospect before they were able to quit their day jobs. Jeff Neal is a perfect example where he just in the past year or two had finally is done, doing service jobs like waiting tables. But I mean, that took a while. He was in the UFC for a bit. We've seen that in multiple instances where, okay, now I can finally train full time. I can do all this, but it's not something that is easy for somebody who's on the lower tier of this to turn down that contract extension to say, oh no, I'm 3 fights in. I'm a couple years into my contract. You're going to offer me, double or triple that. Sure. Let's sign. Sometimes even more. And again, if you're becoming a hot prospect, the UFC will generally try and re-sign you again early and say, you know what, this guy's clearly going to be a contender. He's going to want more money. Let's hit him now. And he goes from 50K to 50K to 100 or 100, 120 to 120. And he's so ecstatic about that because that's even more life-changing. He just signs on the dotted line and we have him locked in. It's smart. And then if he pans out, great. Because we're making a lot of revenue off of his name and his fights. It's a win for us. If he doesn't pan out, okay, we'll just cut him. Then you become a liability, which we've seen, a whole list of fighters get cut semi-recently. And the ones that get cut are either the new guys that are on huge losing streaks or the names that are probably in that veteran status, probably making 80K to 100K of, show to win. And they're either losing or they're kind of middling, right? And so they get cut. It's not shocking. It's really not. It's something where once you hit a certain level, you either got to be a champion or right in the contender mix, or you're gonna get cut. That's where the UFC is right now with cost cutting measures, and that goes to Endeavor's larger strategy right now. But yeah, it's important to look at. And another thing Ngannou hits on in this interview that is also very important is he talks about medical bills. He talks about how he got a call from a debt collector where they said that somebody didn't get paid, and then, it was a whole issue because he didn't have insurance, because his insurance kicked off in January of 21 or something of this year. And even while he was in fight camp, he saw the doctor for his knee issue in fight camp, but insurance didn't cover it, so it was a whole thing. And he was able to pay that. It wasn't an issue, but he basically said, like, he only has insurance again while he's fighting. You get it for a specified amount of time, and then you've got to go out and get it on your own because you're, as he puts it in air quotes, independent contractor, right? That's under an exclusive contract. That's a huge deal. Not for somebody like Ngannou, who, again, has plenty of money at this point, can easily parlay this new UFC contract or boxing, as he alludes to, which I really think that's where he's going. I mean, he could easily parlay that into, sponsorships and all this. He's fine. But if you're a newer fighter or you're on the low end, and again, this is your full-time job, especially when you take away the self-employment tax because you're an independent contractor. So if you're 20K, you probably make 30%, 30 to 35% of that's gone, unless you can justify certain expenses. But most of that's gone right off the bat. And then you've got to pay your coaches, you got to pay for training camp, all that fun stuff. So health insurance again becomes an issue because, okay, I'm going to have health insurance doing this, but Ngannou mentions, if he's just training, he doesn't have a fight coming up, isn't in camp for that, and he gets hurt, he has no insurance unless he goes out and gets it himself. That's much harder for those lower end fighters who are trying to come up. And again, another reason why they're less likely to kind of stand and say, yeah, we need a union. Yeah, we need to do this, because they need the money and they need the coverage and they can't really say no to the boss. It's, again, great interview, important stuff. I highly recommend you check it out. But it gives you great detail insight into what contract negotiations are like, where the leverage of the UFC is compared to the fighter, how that leverage has only grown over time, which we've talked about on the show multiple times. Typically, when a business has a competitive advantage, they continue to grow that out. And part of that, from the UFC's point of view, is the cost dynamics. And because they are technically working with independent contractors, or that's how fighters are classified, it gives them the cover to kind of use big conglomerate tactics against the small vendor. That's, it happens all the time in other industries, right? If you're Apple or Tesla, we'll go with Tesla because of all the fun stuff in the news, right? And you've got a small subcontractor or vendor who's trying to help you out. I mean, you can bully them as much as you want in contract terms. That vendor isn't going to be able to redline much. If I'm trying to, through my own consulting, right? If I'm trying to do a contract with Dell or Apple or Microsoft or Google, any of that stuff, which I've had some opportunities to look at those, I mean, I cannot redline almost any of their contracts. If they basically tell me the terms, and I pretty much have to accept them. If I come back and say, you know what, let's try and change this, let's try and do this on in terms of, various parts of non-competes or whatever. No, they're gonna say, yeah, that's great. I'll find somebody else. And that's what the UFC is able to do here. Oh, what's that fighter? You want more money? That's great. I'm gonna go pick up this guy on the regional circuit who also wants to be a fighter and change his life because he's on, 2K and 2K, and I'm about to give him 10 times that. And he's going to finally be able to live out his dream of fighting full time or being in the UFC, being with the best, right? The brand sell. Again, amazing business model. I cannot stress enough how much this business model should be taught just from an academic perspective in MBA and DBA classes. It's a brilliant business model. But when it comes to ethics and morals, that's a whole nother thing. Social responsibility, all that stuff. Again, this is one to look at. So let me know your thoughts on the interview. If you go watch it or if you have watched it, let me know if it's changed your mind about anything. I'd particularly love to hear from people who maybe are like, oh, media is just saying this or this, blah, blah, blah. And Dana's saying this. I trust Dana. And then they watch that interview and it kind of is like, oh, this is coming from Francis too. If Francis saying this made a difference for you, I'd love to hear it. Anyone else as well. But I mean, especially if it really kind of pushed you over the edge of like, okay, this is where fighter pay is at. Because again, it's kind of all right there, guys. There's plenty of evidence. It's not just media now, it's fighters. There's evidence all over the place for this stuff. So let me know your thoughts on it. All right. Next thing we're going to talk about is Endeavor's Q3 earnings for 2022. Bunch of articles out there. I'm looking at the wrap on this one just because it gives a good highlight. Where it is titled Endeavor Q3 revenue slides 12%, hurt by timing of sports events, a sale of scripted content unit. So we'll come back to that part because that's good. But sports and entertainment conglomerate run by R. Emanuel reported revenue of 1.22 billion, not 122 billion. Otherwise, compared with 1.39 billion last year, just shy of the 1.23 billion forecast of Wall Street. So it missed Wall Street's forecast there. The year ago results, though, did include 334 million in revenue from Endeavor content, which was sold this past January to a South Korean firm. That, again, I've talked about Endeavor content a little bit. They did Severance. They did See, His Dark Materials. They've done a bunch of pretty solid stuff. And so they sold that off to, I forget the name of the group, but a South Korean group, 80% took a stake in Endeavor content. And so that 334 million hit for last year, even though the actual sale was finalized in January, right? So company also warned it's likely to miss Wall Street revenue targets for the year, forecasting $5.24 billion to $5.33 billion, which is still a crazy revenue, below the average of $5.36 billion that was predicted by analysts. That being said, they have raised their EBITDA, which again, they love to do this, to between 1.15 billion and 1.18 billion for the year, up from 1.13 and 1.17 that was predicted from the company at the end of June. The 1.16 billion midpoint of the new guidance represents a $10 million jump from the second quarter forecast. Manuel says our business performed well in the quarter despite a turbulent macroeconomic environment, which it was pretty turbulent. It was pretty ridiculous. Given our unique positioning relative to a set of highly resilient secular industry trends across premium sports and entertainment content and live events, we remain confident in our ability to continue delivering on our long-term growth strategy while also being good stewards of capital. They also had a net loss attributable to shareholders of 4 cents per share, which reverses the profit that they had made before of 16 cents per share. So they lost about 10 million compared to profit of 42.5 million. Repaid $250 million of debt, bringing long-term debt to $5.34 billion, down from $5.63. And they plan to do another $250 million by the year end. Sports rights properties, right, jumped 39%. So that's almost all UFC. That's, again, another key piece here. You've got a couple of other things like PBR, but really like the majority of that is UFC. So that jumped 39% to to 402.3 million, driven by an increase in media rights fees and live events such as UFC matches. And events and experience saw a modest decline of 1%. Representation dropped 42%, but that was because of Endeavor content. So let's unpack all this, because I know I throw a bunch of stuff at you from the article. Basically, revenue slid overall. Their EBITDA went up, though, so meaning they're, again, confident in where their target of true profit's going to lie, so to speak, despite overall revenue being down. Because revenue is one thing, but that doesn't take into account costs. So that's basically saying, right, if your revenue's down, but you're raising your EBITDA, generally, you are saying that you're going to cut costs. It's one of those things where it's you don't have to, right? But if since it's really your profit comes from how much money you make and then how much you have to pay in costs, if your revenue is sliding a little bit and you think your revenue is going to continue to slide, the only way to make that up is through costs or capital assets. There are other ways, but my guess is costs is where they're really, looking to make up most of that. You also see that sports business saw a 40% jump, which is huge. $402 million jump in just a quarter, driven by media rights fees and live events. Those are going to be pretty much live events, and ticket prices are up. We've talked about this, and they're not always going to be a sellout, but they've been on a sellout streak, and they're going to continue that. That's part of, at least for the foreseeable future, I believe, because that's part of having shows at the Apex. Apex is a low-cost show, right? Think about last week's UFC. A lot of contender series guys, not super thrilling, down the line in terms of big names or anything. And it's in the Apex, so again, it's cheap. You're only selling VIP experiences. You're able to cut production costs drastically because you're not having to move people, not having to set up the octagon, pay for their flights, their hotels, all that. That's all. Don't have to pay employees, all that. No, it's all just set up. And so you do those, which are all low cost, and then on the ones where you have a bit of higher cost, like this weekend, right? Which Madison Square Garden, you're going to have marketing, you're going to have logistics, all that fun stuff, setting up the arena. You get sellouts even with the higher ticket prices because you're doing them less frequently, right? It's a big difference. Ari Emanuel hinted at this a while ago, where a ton of fans fly in for these events, or if they're going to UFC Orlando December 3rd, they're probably flying in. There's much people in Florida too, but there's a huge portion that are flying in to see this. That's very different than 2019, 2018, where you might have had UFC Wichita, which was like JDS versus Ivanov or something. And it wasn't a sellout by any means, and it still did fine. But, okay, I'm going to see a live event there. So why would I now fly to Orlando? Maybe the card's better, so maybe I do that. But, I get to see an event in my hometown, which is great. It's less expensive for me as a fan. I'm just going to go to that one instead of flying and getting a hotel room and doing all that, et cetera, right? So this kind of forces fans' hands, because unless you're going to one of the big pay-per-views or one of these special fight nights, you aren't going to see the UFC live probably. You're not paying the exorbitant VIP exclusive access for Apex fights, unless the card is amazing. But again, generally, as I've talked about, they've been kind of lackluster in terms of name value. So live events are going to continue to sell out, I think. And then the media rights deals, again, are fixed. So, yeah, it makes sense that revenue is up so high. It's going to continue. I would bet good money that their Q4 sports property revenue is also significantly higher than Q4 of last year, right? But where things get a little dicey here, and where you have to remember that there is some exposure for Endeavor, comes back to their debt. They still got $5.34 billion in debt. And we know that 40% of that is variable interest, and interest rates are at an all-time high. Now, luckily for Endeavor, inflation kind of cooled a little bit based on the CPI reports this week. So that'll help them because Fed might actually kind of tone down its language, look to pivot a little bit more, talk about tapering off the interest rate rises. But still, I mean, that interest on that debt on 40% is you went from an interest rate of 2%, I mean, last year, end of last year even, to now like 7. You tripled your interest rate on your debt. And let me tell you, on $2 billion of little over $2 billion of debt, 2% interest versus 7% interest is massive. It's insanely big. And Endeavor content getting sold, right? That was a huge huge windfall for them because it sold for around $785 million. But that you had to spin off and sell part of your business. Something that was producing good content, in my opinion. I'm not sure how profitable it was. Obviously profitable enough. It got the attention of a group in South Korea that wanted to buy it. But I mean, that's something to think about. Because as macroeconomic conditions get more turbulent, if they do, which again, I've been saying for a while, I think they will. We've seen that. We've seen them bounce back recently because of inflation stuff, but we've seen high interest rates. We've seen kind of this wild roller coaster. If it continues to get worse and we hit a full-blown recession in 2023, well, then we have to take a look at, are people going to buy pay-per-views? Maybe not. It's not going to affect UFC too much. But are people going to stop going to events? Yeah, maybe. And that could affect UFC and Endeavor. But sports properties are probably safe. Again, because so much of their costs are basically fixed. A ton are fixed and revenue. Sorry, costs and revenue are fixed. Costs less so. Costs are more variable, but still controllable. Revenue is essentially fixed. That was the ESPN deal. That was these media rights deals that we've talked about over the past several months, renegotiating in the UK, in Brazil, all these other places, right? I mean, that's a huge deal. The rest of Endeavor, it's got to turn a profit. If things get worse, if interest goes up, the UFC will do its best to continue to be the crown jewel and help pay all this stuff off. But it doesn't mean Endeavor is completely insulated. If things really turn bad, and especially if anything happens with the UFC, right? We've got the sports betting stuff we're going to talk about here in a minute. And we've got the lawsuit, although I doubt that's moving anywhere soon. Then Endeavor's in big trouble. If something happened with sports betting where the UFC got fined a ton, or out of nowhere, the antitrust lawsuit moved extremely quickly and settled with the side of the plaintiffs, UFC is in big trouble. And or it doesn't even have to be big trouble. Even if UFC takes a significant hit, Endeavor is in big trouble at this point. That's why Endeavor bought the UFC, is to be their safety net. And they might need it. They might need it coming up. So again, interesting times. First time we've seen Endeavor revenue slip like that for a bit. And again, they're still confident with their profit margins, so they expect to still increase EBITDA, but it's macroeconomic environment's taking its toll. And especially with that debt, that's the thing to watch out for. That's why they're making these $200, $250 million payments. That's a big reason they're trying to get that off the books ASAP, or at least paid down, especially the variable stuff. Anything that's fixed interest, okay, yes, it's an issue, but not that much of one. It's the variable interest debt I'm sure they're trying to pay down as fast as they possibly can. Let me know your thoughts on this. Let me know if you think Endeavor is really exposed here. If there's any real issues. Nothing to fret about yet, in my opinion, but just something to keep an eye on. Because again, you never know how things can turn, right? Twitter, all that fun stuff, it can turn fast. So gotta just be careful with it. All right, next thing I want to cover here is something I didn't get to speak on that I saw right before Halloween, because again, I've been having technical difficulties and just fun life stuff. But Al Zulino, and again, Al, if you're listening to this, I apologize, man, because I have the worst at pronouncing names. And we've talked before. He's a friend of the show. I should know how to pronounce it effectively. So that's on me. That one is on me. But he spoke about in a thread on Twitter about how the World Fight League hadn't really said anything since 2021 when they went on the Ariel Helwani show, and Ariel did a Substack on him, and it was supposed to debut coming up this year, right? Supposed to have a bunch of teams. They had talked about GSPV and involved all this stuff. So he spoke with a source, and I trust him on this. He does great work, so I will vouch for him in this regard. Speaking with a source, I'm just going to go through this thread here in quotes. After preliminary talks and a full sales deck and entire schedule laid out for the events, the owner and CEO slowly vanished until he was completely gone. Doesn't appear that they took the money and ran. The project was just dropped. There were plenty of opportunity to sell the idea to sponsors and backers. CEO failed to effectively sell the idea, making concessions all along the way until the show was just another MMA event. Money backers slowly started pulling away, and then it all just completely vanished. Goes on to say the idea was strong. There was support for it by both money and industry. Important. We'll come back to that. Somehow he was unable to sell it all, fell back into his old business partners, and that was the death knell. Now remember, this guy was originally part of World Series of Fighting, right? And so the old business partners could be World Series of Fighting Global, which isn't what the PFL is now, although they're in current lawsuit talks because of a bunch of issues. But just to back up a little bit, if you haven't listened to the podcast episodes on this, again, World Series of Fighting turned into PFL in the US, but there was World Series of Fighting Global, which still exists and still can hold events in Brazil and the UK and all this stuff. And so there's currently a lawsuit and some issues going on where World Series of Fighting Global is essentially suing PFL, saying like, hey, you can't go have a bunch of shows in the UK. You're allowed 3 every year, I think, 2 or 3 every year. You do more than that, or you advertise more than that, like you're in breach of the contract of the sale of the business, and all this fun stuff. Because World Series of Fighting was in financial turmoil. They sold. And again, kind of rebranded, but a lot of people stayed on. You had Ali still heavily involved, Ray Sefo, all that fun stuff. So old business partners here could mean World Series of Fighting Global guys. I don't think it's PFL because they would have been a competitor to that, but this guy was involved at World Series of Fighting. So that might be who that is. This thread goes on to say it is impossible to express how disappointing it all is. There was a real opportunity of promise. I hope someone else picks up the idea and rolls with it. MMA deserves better than what it has, end quote. So don't know who the source is there, but essentially you have a scenario where CEO couldn't sell the idea. He had a platform, he had backers, he had sponsors, couldn't quite sell it. And then made concessions, and here you go. This isn't super uncommon in the startup world, right? I've seen this happen before multiple times. And I've talked about it on the show a lot. This is another supporting factor. Pitching the idea is 95% of startups. It's sales. In order to be a successful CEO in a startup world, you have to sell. You are really just the top salesman. That's what a CEO generally does, especially in startup land. Yes, they make several key decisions. If you're small enough, especially with hiring and all that stuff, but really your job is to go out there and make the big deals, catch the whales, to sell the idea, the vision to your customers, to your financiers, whether that's banks or individual investors or like angel investors or VCs, doesn't matter. You are the salesman. And if you remember, when we saw him speak on the Ariel Helwani show, this was not a polished sales guy. This was a guy who had worked in World Series of Fighting, had the MMA background, had an idea that he really wanted to run with, but he was not nearly as salesy as, say, a Chatri Situdong, right? Or a Don Davis. Who those guys go out there and they sell their brands hard. They talk about, the potential of all these viewers, the profitability, the deals they're doing. They're true salesmen, and they're able to pitch to investors to make a lot of money. Um, Funny enough, this was not planned, but funny this week, while I was kind of getting together the ideas for this episode and finalizing what I was going to go through, John Nash posted something from Sequoia talking about the FTX breakdown in crypto, and how Sequoia was talking about in the chat how they loved the vision, they loved the ideas, all that stuff. That is it. It's I cannot stress enough. It is just selling you can have literally a piece of paper and a pen and say, man, this is going to change the world. And if you sell it correctly, people will throw you a stupid amount of money. That's what FTX was. And I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole of the FTX crash and all that fun stuff that's going on, but that's all you have to do is convince a bunch of people with money to buy into your vision, to really, really buy into it, and they will give you money. Adam Newman, again, WeWork, talking about WeWork being a technology company is utterly ridiculous for most people looking at that from afar. But Newman is very charismatic and has the ability to sell the idea and sell you on this vision of we're going to change the world and do all these things. And he got an insane amount of money for it. It comes down to charisma and sales. That's really it. And according to this thread, the World Fight League guy didn't have those. Which, I mean, looking at his interview, yeah, he seemed much more like a guy that was kind of in the operations and kind of knew what he wanted, but didn't have that I can get in front of a crowd and really rev them up and really have them buy into this, which is what you got to be. If you can't do that, you can be a CEO, but then you need a partner, right? I work for companies where you've had the vision guy or the, shy introverted guy who's like, we're going to build this. It's going to be awesome. But then you need somebody to come in and be the sales guy. And that's what they do. They go out and they get a CFO or a president, right? Like sometimes you'll have the CEO and then the president. The president's the one out there selling. The CEO's kind of running in the background doing selling, but also, more. He's not going to be the guy that goes after the whales. You have to have a guy that does that. And when you're starting a brand new company, it's usually the CEO. That's not what happened here. And it died. So I don't think World Fight League is coming around. I think it is dead in the water. That trust out here. And I also, can see that from looking at that interview. I rewatched it again. I mean, he's not quite crisp on the ball to answer some of these questions, which we've seen that happen to Chatri and Don as well, and even Dana, right? That happens to everybody, but he doesn't have the spin needed, doesn't have that kind of buy into how this is going to change everything, and wasn't able to sell it, despite having sponsors and backers and people wanted to throw money on it. Which again, many of us were talking about this is the IFL 2.0. How is this going? But according to this, there were people ready to throw money at it. So yeah, it's one of those things where it comes down to sales. And if you can't sell MMA or startup land, doesn't matter what, you're kind of screwed. You've got to sell it. And that wasn't the case here. So World Fight League is dead, I think, officially. Let me know your thoughts on that. Let me know if you're sad. I'm a little sad. I was curious to see what it was going to look like. I think competition is great for an industry, helps innovation, helps, force changes that are usually great for the customer, right? Competition always helps the customer out. And that would have been nice to see just another product, see what it looked like. Even if it crashed to burn spectacularly, would have been all about it. So let me know your thoughts on this. If you're hoping that somebody else will pick it up, if you thought it was dumb and you thought it was IFL 2.0 and forget this, let me know all your thoughts on that. Because yeah, it's an interesting one and it's sad. But yeah, World Fight League is dead. All right, real quick hit section just because we've got one more big topic to cover. So first up, One Championship has agreed to a multi-year rights deal in Brazil with the Brazilian group Globo. Contract is set to begin in January of 2023. Calls for 12 events to be broadcast annually live in prime time. And it makes Globo the exclusive distributor of One events in Brazil. It's a nice media rights pickup for One. Again, goes hand in hand with the Amazon deal. It's good stuff. It is going to help One get a little bit more respect, I think, and also I believe probably far better money than they were making in Brazil. Don't know that for sure, but I mean, sounds like a good deal there. Also of note, they are set to make their US debut in Colorado. That's adopted their rule set for either May 5th or 6th, I believe, in 2023. So One will be making US landfall come summer of 2023. Who's going to be on that card, all that stuff, I don't know. But again, a big step forward for their expansion that got derailed by the pandemic. Looks like they're making some moves in that regard. Next up, UFC and Battle Motors has expanded their marketing partnership with a new multi-year agreement. So this is from waste360.com, which is great because again, they make electric. They're the first ever official electric commercial truck of the UFC. So these guys make again electric vehicles, I think, for helping with like waste management stuff. If you've seen Battle Motors before, it's that weird. I mean, honestly, it's semi-brilliant marketing, right? In that, if you look at UFCrankings.com, it's light heavyweight. It's sponsored by Battle Motors. Nobody else is sponsored, so it's pretty great. But now, according to this press release, new agreement builds upon the relationship they originally had, and under the terms of the new agreement, Battle Motors will become UFC's first ever official electric commercial truck partner, a designation that establishes a new sponsorship category. Yeah, it offers co-branded opportunities within UFC Premier assets. Not sure what those co-branded opportunities are. I'm hoping just a bunch of electric dump trucks with UFC fights advertised on them. That'd be awesome. If the trash comes, if they come to pick up my trash or recycling and there's just like UFC 282 on it, that'd be pretty great. We're proud that our partnership with Battle Motors continues to evolve, said Paul Senso, Senior Vice President of Global Partnerships, UFC. Like the UFC, Battle Motors, American success story, etc. Fluff. Then Battle Motors CEO Mark Patterson said, quote, Battle Motors truck customers and workers are the toughest of the tough in the U.S. workforce. We are in the streets of factories. UFC brand resonates very strong. Okay. Yep. Fluff. But basically, hey, we're a good brand fit. As an official partner of the UFC, Battle Motors branding will be integrated into some of the UFC's biggest events of the year, including select pay-per-views and fight nights. We'll be on the Octagon. So probably see, I would imagine, at 281, you'll see Battle Motors on the Octagon. But then Battle Motors will also be presenting the custom social series Hits Like a Truck, which features classic UFC fights with legendary finishes. So expect some Francis Ngannou knockouts with Battle Motors Hits Like a Truck, and then the UFC Free Fights YouTube series. So you obviously the YouTube series is around quite a bit, especially right before a big fight like this. They'll have Izzy versus Costa or Izzy versus Whitaker 1, something that highlights doing this forever. So now those YouTube series will be sponsored by Battle Motors. So also going to be around UFC 281 here. Yep, all that fun stuff. So yeah, interesting. Again, really hope I see the trash truck or recycling truck pick up my stuff with just ads for just a jury ad in general would be incredible. Last but not least is the UFC and MMA fan favorite Dustin the Diamond Poirier, according to a press release from the UFC, announced a marketing partnership. That's all it says, but it's with Poirier's Louisiana style will serve as the official hot sauce of the UFC. Again, as an official brand partner of the UFC, branded content will be featured across social media and digital platform, all that stuff. Dustin said, it means a lot to have Poirier's Louisiana style named the first ever official hot sauce of the UFC. Putting in the work, whether it's training for the next fight, creating a hot sauce company, or helping through our Good Fight Foundation. It's all about building a legacy for my family and community. Hot sauces come from the cuisine I grew up with in Lafayette, Louisiana, et cetera, Cajun flavors he loves, all that fun stuff. Poirier's Louisiana style will activate around the highly anticipated Adesanya versus Pereira. Let's see what we'll say. Then it just talks about the card again. So we'll probably see like a card read or something. I wouldn't be surprised if John Anik, gives a shout out to Poirier's Louisiana style, or if in the arena you're looking at like, oh, you can buy it here and that type of stuff from the merch table. I could easily see that as well. But a big move for Dustin. This is what fighters need to do more of. Honestly, this is something. McGregor. It's going to be similar to proper number 12, right? It's going to be this exact same thing where you see proper 12 everywhere. You see the commercials. You see the little McGregor GIF where he has the weird superimposed GIF where he has the bottle and he's walking towards your screen and walking back. It's just kind of goofy. And proper 12 on the canvas. Same type of thing here. This is where fighters can make really good money. Is integrating as a vendor rather than just through their independent contractor ship with the UFC. So it's a huge step for Dustin. Congratulations to him. Be curious to see what the deal terms are. I don't know that we'll hear that for a bit, but yeah, I mean it's big stuff from Poirier there. So that's what you got to do, fighters. Ngannou, I know we talk about pay stuff, like develop brand of something and then integrate with the UFC. Make that as part of the contract. That's really the key here. If you really want the big money, you want to be treated as a partner, all that fun stuff, that's how you do it. You become a sponsor. Become the crypto sponsor that you hate, Ngannou. That's what you got to do. That's our quick hits. Let me know if I missed anything. I know it's been a couple weeks, so if I did, happy to talk about it on the next show, especially if you think it's super relevant. But yeah, that's our quick hits for this one. All right. Last but not least, we need to talk about a fight that occurred last Saturday in the UFC that is now under investigation after suspicious betting was detected. So this article comes from David Perdue and Mark Ramundi over at ESPN. So the fight was between Derek Minner and Shalian Narandan Biaki. I'm screwing this up, y'all. Which ended abruptly in the first round, and it's being investigated by a U.S.-based betting integrity firm after several sports books, multiple states reported suspicious wagering on the featherweight bout. So if you were watching this live, and I wasn't, but I saw, some highlights and Twitter stuff going on, there were a lot of people talking about like ton of late money coming in on Shalian, and really like wasn't normal in the sense of here's a bunch of late money and then the odds have changed or there's kind of an evening out. It's just tons and tons of heavy pouring on that late notice. Article says, odds moved dramatically in the hours leading up. I think they doubled, right? I think it went from like a negative 175 or negative 200 to like negative 400. Bettors were convinced that not only would Nuran Danbiki win, but would also do so in the first round. So that's the other thing is you all of a sudden money pouring in a knockout in the first round, the fight to last fewer than 2.5 rounds. That's going to trip an alarm. It's one thing for all of a sudden there's a bunch of late money coming in on fighter money line. Another for like a specific prop. That's super weird. So on Saturday, rumors circulating among bettors that Minner was injured. Odds moved for his opponent from negative 228 to negative 420. All right, so close. In 4 hours before the fight. That's a lot. Just 30 seconds into the fight, Minner threw the left kick, hurt his knee, all that fun stuff. Matthew Holt, president of U.S. Integrity, said the company cannot reveal any details of an ongoing investigation. Our goal is always to notify the industry of any potential nefarious, abnormal, suspicious activity as soon as possible, as they can take action as quickly as possible, Holt told ESPN. In this case, we hope that by sending a couple hours before the fight started, we may have helped prevent more suspicious bets from getting through. So the UFC responded via a statement. Like many professional sports organizations, UFC works with an independent betting integrity service to monitor wagering activity on our events. Our betting integrity partner, Don Best Sports, which is a leading global supplier of real-time betting data for North American sporting events, will conduct a thorough review of the facts and report its findings. At this time, we have no reason to believe either of the athletes who were involved in the bout or anyone associated with their teams behaved in unethical, irresponsible manner. So it's, again, one of those things where, here, Minner's manager, Andrew Lee, of Disorderly Conduct Management, wrote that he was unaware of anything like this, but did not provide any further clarity on the situation. Miners goes on to mention Miners coached by James Krause, which we've talked about on this podcast, and his 1% Club Discord channel with betting tips where you pay and then he makes the bets for you, right? Part of what probably sparked the October 17th UFC memo about like, hey, you can't bet on your fighters' fights anymore and all this fun stuff, and fighters can't bet on it. A source familiar with Minder's camp said his left knee was absolutely injured going into the fight. So that's, doesn't mean the fix was in, according to Joey Odessa, longtime respected MMA odds maker, but rather someone definitely knew something. This is the kind of nightmare the UFC was trying to avoid, in that this doesn't look great, right? And mind you, Don Best Sports is a partner, but not, it's a sports betting partner. It's not exactly like an independent authority where that's all they do, right? At least from what I can tell from my research. So this is what they were trying to avoid with the October 17th issue, especially with Krause, who has that Discord channel, sends out tips, and it's talked about basically betting every fight. They had to protect themselves because eventually something like this would happen. The fact it happened this fast is interesting. And I'm not saying that Krause was involved in this and, he was telling people to bet or any of that. I don't have any proof of any of that stuff, but it is a scenario where it doesn't look great for the UFC's reputation. And gambling is a huge, huge part of Endeavor and the UFC's plans, right? Endeavor bought the IMG Arena software to integrate their real-time stats that they already bought from UFC Stats, which used to be, oh man, I'm blanking here today. Used to be another website, right? Fight Metric. That's what it was. And that's part of the integration of, okay, now we've got all these stats. We can help with our daily fantasy stuff for DraftKings. We can take those stats and help integrate it into our sports betting apps and all this stuff. It's a big piece of what Endeavor's trying to build in their ecosystem. Getting flagged like this is a big no-no. And especially in the gambling world, right? It doesn't take much where if you get flagged like this stuff once or even a couple times, it can really hurt the reputation. And a lot of people will just be like, I'm going to stay away from that. I can make money elsewhere. And the authorities will get involved, right? Obviously, you had an outside source essentially say, like, we're going to look into this and it could cause issues. This is the type of stuff where if it got out of hand, and I don't think this necessarily got out of hand, but if this had been worse or got out of hand, this could really come back to bite the UFC in the butt. And as I just spoke about, Endeavor is in a mode of needing the UFC to be that rock to help them weather any economic storm that may or may not be coming. They've had a revenue slide, but their profit is still up. A lot of that is from the huge jump of Endeavor's sports revenue. If the UFC takes a big hit, it's going to affect Endeavor quite a bit. They can't really afford that, especially right now with interest rates as high as they are. I don't think anything will come out of this investigation. It doesn't seem like there's any super nefarious stuff. I haven't heard anything, but doesn't look great optically, and this could be much worse, right? Imagine Krause knowingly, told everyone, oh, okay, like in the Discord chat or whatever, like, oh yeah, my fighter's injured. It's a whole big issue. And all of a sudden you've got all this stuff coming in, right? Instead of, oh, somebody's source leaked it to one bettor who then just was saying like, oh, he's injured, like get in on this action. Let's do whatever. Still not great, but like that stuff at least gives you some shielded of liability. And yes, it triggers an investigation, but you're in the clear. It's whatever. If Krause just goes against all that, I mean, Krause gets in trouble individually, but it also is probably coming back to the UFC in some way, because even though they sent out that statement, regulators would then be like, you have to clamp down on this. Or imagine Minner told people. Imagine was like, look, I can't bet on myself anymore, but everybody else bet on this. Let's make a ton of money because I'm going down in the first round. That's huge. If you find out that that fight is fixed in that regard, even if the UFC isn't culpable, if Minner goes into business for himself and does all that, it's a big black mark on the sport. And it probably makes a lot of bettors either walk away or think twice about placing big bets on events. Doesn't seem like that's the case here. Seems like information got leaked that he was injured, right? And I mean, we just saw TJ Dillashaw clearly injured go into a fight and was able to hide that enough. We didn't see a ton of late movement on Sterling or anything, right? I think Sterling ended at like negative 200 something. But yeah, it's concerning that this happened. And I don't think the investigation will lead to any huge changes or people getting in a ton of trouble, but it's a warning shot, so to speak, for the UFC. They have to clamp down on this. They have to make sure this doesn't happen. They cannot afford a regulatory agency really clamping down on them, slowing them down in their betting and kind of causing issues. Similar to what happened with PFL, right? Like PFL betting, I don't know how much that's really recovered ever since the whole pre-tape thing happened, but I mean that is something where it was very bad for PR as a startup. If the UFC had something like that happen, that would be far worse. That could really affect some revenue areas. They've still got media rights deals. They've still got other things that they're fine, but again, it would be contagious to Endeavor and to Endeavor apps that use UFC data and kind of sell UFC data. And that's something Endeavor can't really risk right now. So again, think we're fine here, at least from the UFC's perspective. And I'm assuming from the fighter's perspective, we'll see. But this is the peril of allowing fighters and coaches and people to bet on whatever. To have Justin James, right? Like say, I'm betting my whole paycheck on myself, to just like not encourage that behavior necessarily, but not discourage it at all. Just say, yeah, go ahead, do it. James Krause is openly talking multiple times about betting on every UFC fight. Okay, great. Whatever. It was kind of just a common thing. You can't have that happen now, especially with something like this occurring. You've really got to tighten some stuff up. So let me know your thoughts on it. Did you bet money and make money on this? Do you think has it cautioned you about betting money at all? If you are a bettor, where do you see something like this and all of a sudden you're like, well, maybe I might just stay away if I see odds shift pretty. I mean, if you're a seasoned bettor and you see odds shift that fast, you probably know, I would imagine, if you're like a hardcore gambler. But if you're just putting some money on, do you really want to risk it at this point? If you're doing like some of the parlays I see a lot of fans do, has this changed your mind or tempered your expectations of when you bet? Let me know in the chats, because I would be very curious to hear from some of you that bet, even if it's just those parlays or you're just putting a couple bucks down here and there. Love to hear your thoughts on it, because it's a big deal, bigger than probably a lot of people realize. It's not good for business. UFC has to avoid going down this path again and having another story, even something similar to this, can't happen again in a close proximity, or that's going to look like a pattern and then bad times. So let me know your thoughts. Curious to hear. All right, everybody. That wraps it up for another edition of the Fight Business Podcast. Again, apologize I was out for those 2 weeks, technical issues and just a bunch of other fun life stuff. But I'm back to regular podcasting. I'll do a show next week, but then I'll be off for Thanksgiving here in the US. And then we'll come back in December and roll from there. But might do a special Thanksgiving show that I tape early. We'll see. So there's some business stuff throughout the year. Might save that for the end of the year. Let me know if you guys want a Thanksgiving show, and let me know topics, special topics, not even current events necessarily, just fun business topics you want me to cover. Would love to do something like that if there's an appetite for it. But otherwise, as always, you listen on Anchor, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. Love you guys as always. YouTube, like, subscribe, bell notification. Love everybody that supports this. Means a ton to me. And until next time, get money.